Well, good morning, DeerGrove. I'm grateful to be back with you here today, to be sharing a word from the Lord again today. Just want to say I'm really grateful for our children's ministry. They have been killing it. Sonia obviously did a great job with that very long passage I gave her, and when I went in this morning, I was talking to Gretchen. I received an offer to give my sermon as a mummy wrapped in toilet paper, and it was really hard to refuse, but I'm kind of sorry that I'm up here and not in there, because that sounds like a lot of fun, and you guys know I'm kind of goofy like that, but I passed. Today I want to talk about the story of Lazarus, but I kind of don't want to talk about the part in the Lazarus story that we usually talk about. I think we all know the basics of the story. Lazarus dies from an illness, and Jesus returns from being away and resurrects him, right? That's the basic story, and we like that part. In our tradition, Lazarus' name is synonymous with resurrection. We only get this account of Lazarus here in the Gospel of John. We don't see it in the other three Gospels. And there is this parable in the Gospel of Luke about Lazarus and the rich man, right? But it's a different Lazarus. And it's also in the Gospel of Luke that we see other stories about Mary and Martha. But it's just here in John 11 that we get the account of both the sisters and their dear brother Lazarus and his premature death from an illness. And I think we like to talk about the ending where Jesus resurrects Lazarus and all is well again. But I kind of want to talk about what came in between, the death of a Christian believer and how fellow believers responded to that. So you would think that we as Christians would be pretty comfortable with death, right? After all, we here in the Covenant, we start every Lenten season with Ash Wednesday. And if you came to an Ash Wednesday service, then a pastor or another minister probably put ashes on your forehead in the sign of a cross and pronounced that you are dust, and to dust you will return. So we talk about the believer's death once a year, right? At least once a year. Most of you know I'm working on a doctoral degree in church history right now, and one of my fellow PhD students wrote a paper on this that I thought was really interesting. What he did was he looked at lyrics from the most popular hymns and worship music of the 18th and 19th centuries, and he compared them to the Billboard Top 50 in Christian music from 2010 to 2020, 2010 to 2020, and he compared it to the CCLI that we get our worship music from. What he found was we as believers used to sing about our own deaths in our hymns and in our worship music, and now we don't anymore. In the 1700s and 1800s, 34% of our hymns mention the believer's death. That's about 1 in 3. But in the recent Billboard Top 50, that number dropped down to 4%. 60% of our old hymns mentioned heaven, almost 2/3. In the modern Christian music, that number dropped down to 14%. Hymns mentioning death in general went from 35% to 18%. The only death category where things didn't change very much was the death of Jesus Christ. The old hymns mentioned the death of Jesus Christ about 34% of the time. The Billboard Top 50, 24%. The CCLI was 45%. So not a huge change there. In one measure it went down a little, in one measure it went up. So by this measure, it would appear that we, as modern believers, really don't like to talk about death. We don't like to talk about heaven. We don't like to talk about death in general. And we especially don't like to talk about our own deaths. If we're going to talk about death, let's talk about Jesus' death, which we're going to do in a few weeks at Good Friday and Easter. Jesus' death is safe for us. Jesus' death doesn't make us uncomfortable. Now, there may be a partial reason for this shift. We as a society have gotten much better at cheating death than the people in Jesus' time. So in Jesus' time, average life expectancy overall was 20 to 33 years. However, that number, it's not very good because roughly 50% of the population died before reaching the age of 10, mostly due to infant mortality. So if you were in the lucky 50% of the population that lived to age 10, you had a good chance of living into the ripe old age of your late 40s or early 50s. So in late medieval Europe, if you lived to the age of 10, your life expectancy was age 30 to 33 years. And if you made it to 25, you would probably again live to your 40s and 50s. So death used to be ubiquitous in the average person's life. If you did not die yourself, people around you certainly did. And if you had children, it was expected that you were going to lose at least a few of them, if not in infancy, then at a young age. Now, in our modern era, we're a lot better at living longer. Average life expectancy in the United States is overall 76 to 77 years, about 79 years for women and 73 years for men. Sorry, men, I'd like you to live a couple years longer. The infant mortality rate is 5.4 deaths per 1,000 births, or 0.5%. Now, in my opinion, that's still 5.4 deaths too many, okay? Infant mortality is serious, but it's quite a bit better than the 30% to 50% infant mortality rate that humanity used to live with. Problems that used to be debilitating and devastating to us can now be easily remedied. If you have an infection, we give you antibiotics. If you have appendicitis, we take out your no-good, traitorous appendix. It can be done over the weekend. It's scary, but it's usually not fatal. I gotta look at my husband because he's got the appendix scar. If you're having trouble in childbirth and you or your baby are at risk, we do a C-section. It's not fun. Sometimes they're done when they're not necessary, but usually at the end of it, everyone is alive and healthy. So many things that used to kill us, we take care of them now, and it's no more complicated than spraying a weed, right? And yet, well, okay, C-section might be a little more complicated, but we take care of them. And yet, last I checked, the death rate is still 100%. In the words of Benjamin Franklin, in this life, nothing is certain except death and taxes. This sermon is about death. By the way, it's tax season. Get your taxes done. But death comes for us later now, but it still comes. And I'm guessing that just about every person in here, at some point in your life, you had to deal with an incredibly difficult death. A death that was premature and wrong in every way. A death that may have even made you question the goodness of God. I'm wearing a skirt today that was given to me in 2006 or 2007. It's probably my oldest item of clothing that I still wear. Why am I wearing a skirt that's 17 years old? Can I not buy a new skirt? Well, my mother gave me this skirt. And my mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 2007 at the age of 50. And she died in 2008 at the age of 51. So I keep this skirt no matter how old it is, and I only wear it once or twice a year. I keep it in good condition because it's the last skirt that my mother ever gave me. And I know my mother will never give me another skirt. And I want to hold on to some small part of her. So at the very end of John's gospel, we are told Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. So what that means is John had to make editorial decisions about what to include in this gospel and what not to include. So I won't go into the why right now, but we also think that John's gospel was probably the last gospel to be written. That means at the time that John is writing this, the Roman Emperor Nero has already persecuted the Christians. Stephen in Acts, he's dead. The Apostle James is dead. Paul and Peter, probably dead. And they stayed dead. To our knowledge, they have not been resurrected. So why does John include the story of the resurrection of Lazarus? Does it not have the potential to remind us of everything God did for Mary and Martha that he will not do for us? Like Mary, Martha, you guys, I am so happy that Jesus personally resurrected your brother for you, but what's that to me when my mother is still dust? Now there's a statement. There's a concept in this story that I want you to pay attention to because it gets repeated 3 times, and that's why I had Sonia read that very long text because I really wanted all 3 of them. Martha, when she comes out to Jesus, she says to him, first thing she says in verse 21, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." In other words, Lord Jesus, you could have saved him. You could have done something. And we know from earlier in the chapter, I didn't have Sonia read that, we know earlier in the chapter that Jesus learned Lazarus was sick, and he still waited to go see him. We also know from other texts in other gospels that Jesus did not have to be physically present to heal someone. We saw that with the centurion. He could have healed Lazarus remotely if he had wanted to. yet he did not. The statement Martha makes is so important that Mary echoes it verbatim in verse 32. She comes out to meet Jesus, she falls at his feet, and she says, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Lord, you could have stopped this." Because the uncomfortable reality that we as believers have to wrestle with is that God is all-powerful, and the only reason even a sparrow falls to the ground is because he allows it. In verse 37, we hear a similar sentiment from the Jews who are there to mourn with Mary and Martha. They say, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" This is what a skeptical world says about Christianity. If your God can answer prayers and work miracles, how are people still dying? Where is your God now? I've attended DeerGrove for almost 14 years now. We've been through so much together. So I just want to remind us that we have seen some powerful healings here, some powerful answers to prayer. I will never forget that day. 10 years ago, 2013, Mark Johnson was our chair, and he sent us an email. He was our leadership team chair. He sent an email letting us know that our beloved then pastor had not one but 2 brain tumors. And I must not have been a woman of very great faith at the time, because I remember reading that email and thinking, this is the beginning of the end for her. And most of you know that it was not the end for her, that the tumors were treated, she recovered, and she went on to have her second child. We even saw new life, and she is still pastoring to this day. And I also know that we've had some painful deaths in members of this congregation. We've seen a lot. I don't know why our former pastor was healed while my mother and other members of our congregation are many years gone. What I do know is that I am allowed to say to God, if you had been there, my mother would not have died. If you had done something, my mother would still be here. Jesus does not rebuke Mary and Martha for saying what they say, and we do see in other places disciples say well-meaning things, and he rebukes them. Hey, get thee behind me, Satan. He'll tell them if they're wrong, but with Mary and Martha, he doesn't do that. He could have said to them, what are you crying about? You know that I've got this. You know he'll be resurrected, if not now, then later. But what it says in verse 33, he is deeply moved in his spirit. He is troubled. In verse 35, he weeps with them. In verses 5 through 6, at the beginning of the story, we were told Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Yet when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. The text has to reiterate to us that even though he let this happen, he loved them. Because even when God lets bad things happen to us, he loves us. That is what John wants us to understand. He loved these 3 siblings, yet he still let Lazarus die. And so Mary and Martha are feeling that tension, the tension of a God who somehow loves them, yet has let something horrible happen to them. This passage teaches us that we do not worship a God of toxic positivity, a God who demands that we put on a happy face and be joyful when dealing with death. We worship a God who invites us to be real with him about how death and illness affect us, a God who invites us to wrestle with the seeming paradox of how he can love us and still let bad things happen to us. We worship a God who meets us in his grace, a God who weeps with us. And here, Jesus models what we must be to other believers. We're very fortunate to live in an era where death is generally delayed and people live longer. But this passage models for us that it is our sacred obligation as Christians to mourn with those who mourn, to comfort those who grieve, to come alongside those who have lost loved ones and weep with them. It is okay to remind those who mourn that Jesus is the resurrection and the life. Jesus himself tells Mary and Martha that. And it is okay to remind people that somehow this is all going to work together for the glory of God. We may not see it in this life, but we will in the next. In the meantime, though, we don't mourn as those who have no hope, but we do mourn. We weep, and we walk each other through this scary thing called death. My mother died in Washington State on September 12th, 2008, and I walked through the doors of DeerGrove Covenant Church, or, it was the high school that we were meeting in at the time. But I came into DeerGrove Covenant Church on August 23rd, 2009. I took a little less than a year to mourn my mother, and then I came out here from Washington State to start something new. Her ending was a new beginning. I'm going to ask the worship team to come up while I conclude. So if you're listening to me right now and you don't call Jesus Lord, you can have a new beginning with the one who knows you, whose grace will find you in your grief, who knows the hairs on your head and the number of your days. If you live in the Chicago area, DeerGrove can always be your church, home like it's been mine for 14 years. But for most of you listening to me who call Jesus Lord, who probably committed your precious life to him some time ago, I want to encourage you to commit to him your precious death. Say to him, Lord, you alone know the number of my days. You alone know how much time I have left to serve you. I know that nothing will ever happen to me, save you allow it. May you meet me when I get there with dancing and great rejoicing, and may you comfort those I leave behind, and may it all work together for your kingdom and your glory.